competing the United States in cyberspace?
Given the attention that we're putting on this today, the realization that our nation must change, the strategic environment that it must change, our national defense strategy, our national security strategy, I think will maintain that superiority.
A reassuring answer. During World War II, the United States was concerned that Nazi Germany would be the first to develop an atomic bomb. Today, we're concerned that China could be the first to develop a quantum computer capable of breaking modern encryption. Director Easterly, who's winning the quantum computing arms race?
I would probably ask General Nakasone to weigh in on that specifically.
Congressman, you point out one of the critical things that we're moving towards right now. Our agency creates the keys, codes, and cryptography that ensures the underlying encryption of our nation. We are developing those keys, codes, and cryptography in partnership with NIST to ensure that our nation is safe from a quantum computer, which you just described. National Security Memorandum 10 talks about this. We are well on the way to being able to do that, and we will be able to defeat any type of quantum capability that the Chinese have in the future.
So we're winning the race?
We are.
Great. Artificial intelligence, there's a real risk that advanced AI could enable anyone, anywhere to carry out a cyber attack on critical infrastructure. What can be done to prepare ourselves for a world of widely distributed cyber weapons of mass destruction?
Well, this is an area where I have significant concerns because AI is moving faster. It is moving at a speed that is 3 times the speed of Moore's Law. It is unpredictable, and it will probably be the most powerful weapon of our generation. Most powerful weapon of the last generation was owned and operated by nations who are disincentivized to use it. These are generally owned and operated and produced by private sector companies who are driven by a profit motive. So we need to be very, very specific about the guardrails and ultimately the type of regulation that will help prevent the use of these capabilities for nefarious purposes by rogue nations, by cyber criminals, by terrorists. And we need to move incredibly quickly to do that. I think this and China are the 2 generational issues that we need to be riveted on to protect our nation.
And as you noted, AI development is largely unfolding among a small number of companies, secretly behind the scenes, and I think most of us, even in Congress, are out of the loop. Do you feel like these companies are keeping you abreast of the latest advances in AI and the implications that those advances would have for cybersecurity?
Well, I think one of the good news story is because of the illumination of this issue and the inherent risks by the Congress, by the administration, industry has had to come to the table and actually work in a more transparent way, which we greatly appreciate. But we need to see more of that. And frankly, we need to have secure guidelines in place. There needs to be secure by design for AI, which is why we've been working with all the big generative AI companies and international partners to ensure that when these capabilities are created, security is the top priority.
Now, there are multiple leaders, the CISA director, national cyber director, the deputy national security advisor for cyber and emergency technology, the head of Cybercom, who play a role in setting cyber policy. And there are multiple law enforcement agencies, FBI, Secret Service, Homeland Security investigations, that play a role in combating cyber crimes like ransomware. Who is in charge of coordinating the various moving parts of cyber policy making and law enforcement?
Statutorily, it's the Office of the National Cyber Director that serves that purpose, sir.
And how does your role differ from that of the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies? What's the difference between those 2 roles?
The National Security Council, writ large, yields all mechanisms of national power, and cyber is but one. So when the NSC provides guidance and advice to the President, it's far broader than cyber. Our domain is on...
No, but there's a deputy NSA specifically for cyber, so how does that role differ from yours?
We work very closely together, but the big difference is there is more of an operational flavor to that role than my role. Again, our office is providing strategic and policy guidance, not operational guidance, which is what the National Security Council does with our colleagues. Again, far broader than cyber, but more operational than the Office of National Cyber Director. But I also want to be real clear that we work very closely together. Literally, weekly, we have a sync, leader to leader, but our staffs are working together daily.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Johnson.
Director Easterly, Director Ray, I just want to have a conversation with the two of you, largely around the Maritime, the port situation. It seems to me that our ports are becoming more reliant on equipment, technology, infrastructure from PRC-affiliated firms. I find that concerning. Is that a legitimate threat?
Yes.
So I think it's a good example of the theme that we've been talking about in this hearing in other contexts as well, right? Which is if you're talking about Chinese businesses, there is the potential that they can be leveraged by the Chinese government for all manner of concerns. When you combine that with some of the cybersecurity concerns that have also been discussed here in the context of ports and maritime security, it's sort of a double whammy.
Yeah, I mean, these supply chains, of course, are so interconnected and so heavily reliant upstream and downstream. It doesn't take very much hitch and a giddy-up to start to strangle our ability to engage in international trade or to power the American economy. How do you assess the awareness of our maritime partners, the port operators, shippers, carriers, about this threat?
Yeah, so one of the issues, and you may be alluding to this, sir, is that 80% of cranes in our ports are ZPMC. So it goes to the point about Chinese-controlled infrastructure in our critical infrastructure. Part of the issue is, and we work very closely with the Coast Guard, who serve as the Sector Risk Management Agency for Maritime Transportation Systems, we make all of the owners and operators aware of the very real threat and the risk. But when you have such almost a monopoly in a manufacturer, it's very hard to rip and replace. Same concerns with the communications infrastructure. So what we do is we provide, working with the Coast Guard, information on the threat, and we provide what they can do to mitigate the impact of that threat. So there are things that can be done to lessen that risk, but of course we should work to be able to not have to depend on this type of Chinese infrastructure, which ultimately is controlled by the CCP.
Well, and you're exactly right, and I think that's worth double underlining that 80% of the ship-to-shore cranes are manufactured by PRC-affiliated firms. It does seem like that is quite a liability, all things being considered. Director Ray, more to add on that front?
Well, I would agree with both your comments and Director Easterly's. I would just add that it's about more than just the ports and the cranes. Maritime sector more broadly is something that we know the Chinese have targeted, and that's part of why, together with CISA and Coast Guard and others, we've tried to put out a lot of information about best practices, mitigation guidance, et cetera, to try to reduce the risk, but ultimately, if we're going to be in a more secure posture, we're going to have to be mindful of the Chinese government's ability to leverage its businesses.
So let's assume that y'all are doing everything right. You've done a good job educating these private sector partners because so much of this infrastructure, as we've talked about, whether it's electricity, whether it's water, and now we're talking about ports, really is owned and operated by the private sector. Let's assume you've done a perfect job of educating them. What do you assess they need to do better over the course of the next 3 to 5 years to minimize the dangers of this threat?
I'm happy to start. One other thing I've mentioned, FBI and CIS actually put out something specific about Chinese manufactured drones, which is another area we have significant concerns in. But in terms of what they need to do, it goes back to ensuring that they have an awareness of the threat environment and that they are taking those measures to invest in basic cyber hygiene. Some of this are just taking the basics to understand your infrastructure, to know what the vulnerabilities are, so you can drive remediation of them. That cyber hygiene is so important. I made the point in the opening statement, but I really think it's worth doubling down. Every CEO, every board member, every business leader of a critical infrastructure owner or operator has to see cyber risk as a core business risk. They have to manage it as a matter of good governance and national security. So that's an important message to anybody that leads an organization in this nation.
I would just add to those very good points that much as Director Easterly referred to in her opening statement, same thing in the context of ports and maritime security more broadly, we need victims to reach out to us immediately, because the victim who reaches out to us immediately is the one who's going to supply the information that will enable us not just to be able to share information with them to better mitigate and prevent their attack from becoming worse, but more importantly, in many ways, prevent the attack from metastasizing to other sectors and other businesses. So the first victim that gets contacted, that victim's information is the one that helps us protect all the other organizations and victims that are potentially out there. And so we see all the time, when it's done right, businesses reaching out to their local FBI field office. We're able to be there often within an hour or just a little bit more, sharing technical indicators that they wouldn't have had. The dots get connected. They're better able to prevent that attack from getting worse, but then they're also able to share intelligence, which enables us collectively to then arm other businesses and other ports, let's say in this case, from being victims and getting further left of boom.
Mr. Chair, I would close by noting that we have hyper-optimized these supply chains for efficiency, but we cannot leave resilience behind, including, of course, cyber. Thanks.
Noted.
I yield.
Mr. Auchincloss.
Thank you, Chairman, for today bringing together witnesses with such credibility and commitment to defending our democracy. I appreciate it. This hearing brings to mind my favorite anecdote from the Civil War. It was 1864, and Grant just took command of the Army of the Potomac, and he was surrounded by his senior staff. And they were preparing for their march into Northern Virginia, and they kept on saying, well, Lee's going to do this, and Lee's going to do that, and what if Lee thinks about this? And he snapped, and he said, stop worrying about what General Lee is going to do. Let's make him worry about what we're going to do to them. And I think about that a lot when it comes to cyber, because we have to do all of these things that Mr. Johnson put forward so articulately about making ourselves resilient, but we also have to make them worry about what we're going to do to them. And it strikes me that the best offense we have is not actually the NSA's ability to hit their critical infrastructure, although I know we can do that, and we're in the clear right now, and I'm not going to ask you all the details, but that needs to be there. But actually, the best offense that we have is to turn their domestic populations on those regimes, to allow their own people to debate, to deliberate, to ask themselves whether they like 3-year COVID lockdowns, to whether they like invading another sovereign nation. And Starlink, in the last several years, has proven that it can open up those channels of civic discourse that are so corrosive to authoritarian regimes. This question is for any of you who want to tackle it. But what can we in the U.S. government do to, one, turbocharge our ability to turn on their civic discourse, whether with Starlink or other means, and to, two, to make sure that that decision is U.S. government's decision, not Elon Musk's decision?
I'd like to start, Congressman. I think the key piece that you just talked about is what we've all realized, which is the what we do hasn't changed a lot. The National Security Agency, we do signals intelligence, we do cybersecurity. At U.S. Cyber Command, we do cyberspace operations. It's the how. The how is changing so rapidly. And this is where we have an impact against China. Much in the same way Grant in the Wilderness Campaign decided that we're going to focus on our strengths, not worry about his adversary. That's the same thing we have here. We have our strengths. Our strengths begin with our partnership. Our strengths begin with the fact that we are able to talk with our private sector and be able to understand broadly what is going on. The fact that we are now publishing these type of insights in an unclassified manner, hanging them on our websites, must and will.
But do we have a plan, General? Do we have, and maybe this is for Mr. Coker or Ms. Easterly, but do we have a plan for internet freedom in Iran, in Russia, in China, so that their populations can engage? The Ayatollah is 84 years old. He's got advanced prostate cancer. There's going to be a succession soon. Are we ensuring that the Iranian people have as much of a voice as possible in making their discontent known as that succession planning is happening? Same thing, of course, in China. That's what really keeps Xi Jinping up at night, I believe, is not actually U.S. politics, it's latent Chinese politics.
Well, I'll come at it from the FBI's end. I mean, much of what you're talking about are operations that would take place, in those countries. But that's why when we call out transnational repression by all the governments you listed off, that's so important, because those repressive techniques that you're talking about, they're not just doing them in their home countries, they're exporting it onto U.S. soil. And their victims, their intended victims, are primarily the diaspora of those countries, dissidents and critics here who have the audacity, in their view, to criticize those regimes, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians, et cetera. And so when we take action through exercise of the rule of law here to protect those victims and call out that behavior, those families are in contact with their family members back in those countries, which helps create the dynamic you're talking about.
I agree with you, and we've had excellent hearings on transnational repression, and I understand the feedback loops. I would say, though, that we need a whole-of-government strategy for Starlink on steroids for these authoritarian regimes. In my last 30 seconds, Director Wray, I want to compliment you on the work that you've done since October 7th to improve public safety in the United States. I know there's been a focus of yours, and that in December you testified that you saw blinking lights everywhere and that you were especially concerned about Hamas-inspired domestic terrorism. And we know that the Chinese are fomenting that, frankly. Regrettably, the Boston City Council in my home state rejected $13 million of federal terrorism funds that would help in part with cybersecurity, but also terrorism preparation operations. What would be your message for municipalities and localities about the importance of regional preparation to defend against terrorism, both cybersecurity as well as kinetic?
We are, since October 7th, in a heightened threat environment from various forms of terrorist risk. The biggest one is an inspired attack by the conflict in the Middle East, but an attack that's inspiring some individual here in a horribly misguided way to commit an attack. And that risk is more likely to be a lone actor targeting so-called soft targets here in the United States, which is, facilities, houses of worship, schools, places that people every day in America go, including in municipalities like the ones you're talking about. And so to defend the public we all serve, we need to be mindful of that heightened terrorist risk.
So time has expired. Ms. Hinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to our distinguished guests. Thank you so much for appearing before our committee to discuss these blatant threats that the PRC poses, not only to our cyber security, but to our national security on many, many levels. And Director Wray, I wrote it down when you gave your opening statement. You talked about, they want to wreak havoc and real-world harm on us, and we need to be ready if and when. And I think it's very clear today from our discussion that it's not if, it's already happening. So our answer is resiliency, it's prevention, and it's accountability. And so I'm pleased to hear about the work that you're doing interagency to counter these threats. And back in September, the chairman and I led a letter to you, Director Wray, as well as to Secretary Austin, requesting that the FBI and Pentagon brief members of this committee specifically on the gate crashers at many of our sensitive facilities, U.S. military bases, critical infrastructure. And it's unacceptable that the PRC was even able to gain access to many of these sensitive sites. They scuba dived around sensitive military equipment. They were able to infiltrate our Army test sites, missile sites, and then, of course, the most egregious example of the spy balloon going across our country. It's a blatant attack on our country to undermine our national security and breach our military and technical innovation. So I appreciate the prompt response to our letter, and I want to ensure that this conversation continues, that our security agencies are prioritizing this at the highest level. So I would be curious what the FBI is doing right now to further secure these critical areas to ensure that we are stopping these threats to the American people before they happen.
So we are tackling it through a combination of investigations, intelligence sharing, and engagement. And to break that down a little bit further, we have in all 56 of our field offices counterintelligence task forces that are FBI-led, but that have representatives serving on them from the relevant military agencies that are in that area, as well as in many cases state and local law enforcement, who are a very important part of giving us sort of additional Fort multiplier to help counter the threat. And so we've had any number of investigations into different kinds of efforts by actors associated with the PRC to spy on, if you will, or in other ways target our military installations. Intelligence sharing, obviously things that we learn through our investigations, we're able to marshal that and then share that back with our DoD partners so that they can use that to be even savvier about how they defend their installations. And then engagement, we're trying to make sure that the lines of communication are wide open between us and whatever military facility is in that particular area. When I visit an FBI field office, and I've visited all 56 twice, I'm on my third round now, it never fails to inspire me the close relationship that exists between the local FBI field office and the military presence in that state.
Yeah. And I'm sure there are many, many of those partnerships that have been very, very successful in stopping many of these threats, but we can't rest on our laurels, and obviously continuing those conversations is going to be critical, and look forward to maybe further conversations there, perhaps in classified setting, about what more we can be doing. I want to quickly follow up in the remaining time that I have about rip and replace, because that is a huge, huge concern. Recently introduced a bill with many members of this committee, including the chairman and the ranking member, Representative Molinar, to help kind of breach that critical funding gap that exists for rip and replace. But it's certainly concerning when you hear about these routers and all of the different equipment that exists within our telecom. Some of them are very, very small organizations that do not have the resources. So we want to, of course, repurpose some of those COVID funds and put them toward ripping out this Chinese telecom equipment. That is a huge vulnerability. So Director Easterly, this question's for you. Can you address really the importance of a rip and replace program, not just for this level, but maybe do we need to look at expanding it further? And what are the consequences of us not taking action here?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly complex supply chains, as you know. But when it comes down to some basic fundamentals, I think you pointed out around the bill itself, 24,000 pieces of Chinese software in these supply chains. And so it's imperative that we help the owners of some of these less resourced entities to be able to make these important changes to reduce risk. Two things I would add is we co-lead what's called the Information Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force. And so I'm not even sure that they know that there may be capabilities with funding to do that rip and replace. So I think that education there is incredibly important. The other thing that I think we need to be aware of, and of course, the FCC has a covered list with a variety of different Chinese equipment, from Dahua to Huawei to ZTE to Hytera. What we do is we make critical infrastructure aware that that may exist in their systems, so they can also be aware of the threat, either mitigate it or replace it. I think the whole effort is incredibly important, and commend you for the bill.
Yeah, well, certainly we have a lot of vulnerability, and we're working to get, and I realize I'm almost out of time, Mr. Chairman, but we're working to get a true accounting of what vulnerabilities still exist within even government buildings or even leased government buildings. So thank you for all of you appearing before our committee today. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each of our witnesses for leading extraordinary agencies at a time of great turbulence and instability in the world. Our cybersecurity capabilities are perhaps one of our greatest threats and opportunities in the 21st century. We must do more to deter and respond to threats to our systems coming from the hostile actors across the world, including North Korea, Russia, and Iran. And we know the Chinese Communist Party has incredibly sophisticated cyber infrastructure and will become, or has been discussed today, already one of our fiercest competitors on this front. One of our greatest assets, something which the CCP overlooks, is our diversity. As Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi and Vice President Kamala Harris have both said, our diversity is our power. One aspect in which we can can and must do so much more is to build and rely on a diverse pool of talent in the field of cybersecurity. I know this is a top priority for the Biden-Harris administration and for all of you as leaders of your respective agencies. So turning to you, Director Coker, I know this topic is something important to you and you have spoken about it before. Can you speak on the administration's broad effort to increase our cyber workforce by sourcing talent from diverse places and the benefit it brings to our ability to combat CCP efforts?
Thank you so much for that question and that important topic. And to me and the administration, diversity is all about achieving positive mission outcomes. That message cannot be misunderstood. It's about positive mission outcomes, and we do that by having the strongest teams possible. I talked to 500,000 open cyber jobs. So whatever we've been doing lately hasn't been working. So what do we need to do to fix that? We have the National Cyber Workforce and Education Strategy that has its pillar. The two that are most relevant to your question are expanding the federal cyber workforce and then America's writ large. We need to do that by, number one, having people realize the impact to national security. We talked about national service. I think Americans want to serve our nation and need to be clear about cybersecurity is serving our nation. Growing up, about the only national service we had by and large was wearing a uniform, voting, and paying taxes. That's changed today. All those critical infrastructure segments that we have, that's national security. So we need to make sure there's an opportunity to serve our nation in cyber. Number two, it used to be a misnomer that cybersecurity and cyber in general was a technical endeavor. That's not the case. Folks think they have to be STEM. Cybersecurity is about critical thinking. It's about agility. It's about being open-minded. So one need not be an engineer or a scientist to make contributions in cybersecurity. Also want to add that there are communities across the country that aren't exposed to these opportunities. I'm a rural kid from Kansas. I didn't know I could serve until there happened to be a recruiter that came from the Naval Academy. I hadn't even heard of the Naval Academy. You can expand that to cybersecurity. So we need to go places where we haven't gone before. And leaders know that we need to take opportunities for people. There's a level of risk. Need not lower standards at all. But sometimes qualifications that are listed are not valid. People can learn. We find the right people, we develop them, retain them, and we turn them loose. So the administration's perspective is let's find the right people, looking in places we haven't necessarily looked before. And why? Because we need more, better, different people to achieve positive mission outcomes.
Thank you so very much. I now want to turn to another important topic which weighs on all of our minds, and that's the 2024 national election. As we frequently remind everyone, the 2020 presidential election was the safest, most secure election in our nation's history. However, the 2016 election preceding it was scarred by Russian hacking and broad disinformation campaigns, which severely compromised the integrity of the election. Anyone on the panel, if you would be willing to answer the question or address this, in an unclassified setting, is there any evidence at this time the CCP is using artificial intelligence to interfere in the U.S. elections? And how do we ensure this election is free from CCP influence? And I only have 8 seconds, so sorry.
Negative 11 seconds.
Probably defer to my Intel colleagues on whether the CCP is actively using artificial intelligence. But based on the DNI's report in December about the activity in the 2022 midterms, which talked about the aggregate scope and scale of foreign activity and influence and interference being more than we saw in 2018, and specifically Chinese attempts at influence, we should expect it. We should absolutely expect that foreign actors will attempt to influence and that they will interfere. But to be very clear, Americans should have confidence in the integrity of our election infrastructure because of the enormous amount of work that's been done by state and local election officials, by the federal government, by vendors, by the private sector since 2016, since election infrastructure was designated as critical infrastructure. It's that work that should make the American people confident in the security, resilience, and integrity of the American election system.
General's time has expired. Mr. Jimenez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually share the thoughts of my colleague on the other side, Mr. Auchincloss, about the need to provide technology so that the people that live in repressive regimes like Russia, China, Iran, we actually start a second front without shedding any blood, so that the people inside can actually, they're all seeking freedom, and we need to help them achieve freedom and throw the shackles of this regime. So hopefully we can have that kind of technology to allow them to communicate with themselves, so that can happen. One of the things that happened, very interesting, there were hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets of Cuba back in a couple of years ago in July, and the first thing that the Cuban government did was shut down the internet, identify the leaders, and then took them out. If we can find a technology that allows the people to communicate with themselves, I think we can actually help the cause of freedom around the world. And so, I'll be working with my colleague there to see how we can make that happen. I actually believe that the cyber war that we're conducting right now is a battle, and I think actually the race is really the race to AI. Do you agree with that, Ms. Easterly?
I think AI will play a tremendous role in the battlefield to come, but both on private sector as well.
How important is the accumulation of data in this race to AI?
Well, it's all about data at the end of the day. So
well, good.
Data is the gold.
So here's where I'm
going. Data is the oil.
Okay, there's 150 million users of TikTok in the United States. How valuable is that data to the CCP?
Enormously valuable.
Okay. So, Mr. Ray, knowing that it is critical for the United States to win the race to AI, and TikTok is a huge source of data, actually in a language that they need, because I believe that the Chinese language is actually a disadvantage and that they need more Western languages in order to win that race. How critical to our security is well, TikTok is providing all this data to the CCP. Do you think that's a security threat to the United States?
I have very significant security concerns about TikTok, and it's a combination of the ability that the Chinese government would have to, if they choose to exercise it, to control the collection of the data, to control the recommendation algorithm, and if they wanted to be able to control and compromise devices. And if you layer AI, as you're saying, right on top of all that, it just amplifies those concerns, because the ability to collect U.S. person data and feed that into their AI engine, it just magnifies the problem. We look at AI as a concern in the wrong hands, but we also know that American AI innovation is the envy of the world, and the Chinese are trying to steal it. So the big concern, of course, is that they will not only steal American data and feed it into their AI engine, but that they'll steal American AI innovation and make their theft even more effective. And all you have to do is look at the Equifax hack from several years ago, where they were able to steal the personally identifiable information from 150 million American people.
Director, I'm running out of time. I need to ask you a question. It's a direct question. It's a tough one, probably. I don't know how you're going to answer it. Would you ban TikTok in the United States? So yes or no?
Well, there's a decision-making process that's outside my lane, but let me try to answer it this way. As long as the Chinese government has the ability to control all these aspects of the business, I don't see how you get your way clear to mitigating those concerns.
Fair enough. I also share the concerns of my colleague, Mr. Johnson. Over the past 8 months, I've worked with the Chairman Gallagher and members of the Committee on Homeland Security led by my Transportation and Maritime Security Subcommittee, to conduct a joint investigation examining cybersecurity and supply chain threats at U.S. maritime ports posed by the People's Republic of China. I anticipate sharing our joint investigative report soon. When I was the mayor of Miami-Dade County, we operate one of the biggest ports, in the United States. And lo and behold, when I look at our cranes, they all had Chinese writing on it. So they all came from China. 80% of the world's cranes are actually manufactured in China. But what's worse, I thought that we were okay with software. Maybe software developed in Western countries was okay operating these cranes, but we also find out that in a lot of instances, the software is shipped to China, stays there for over a year, and then it's installed in China, and we don't know what happens to it in that time. And so operating that software, knowing that software either reporting back to China or that somehow it can be turned off at any time, think about it. 80% of the world's commerce is controlled by those cranes. So thank you, and I'm way over, so thank you very much for indulging me, Mr. Chairman.
Apparently the lights are also controlled by somebody. Carlos and I climbed up in one of those cranes. In Miami. I didn't know that I was afraid of heights until that moment, but it was illuminating. Ms. Stevens.
I'm always learning about our chairman. This is a real honor to be with all you. This is another just top-notch hearing, and certainly, we're not the Homeland Security Committee or even Armed Services, and so, yes, getting into these points about the entanglements of cybersecurity threats and its realities, of which I'd love to ask you about. I just wanted to start from a more elevated place, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Ray and Mr. Coker. What is the CCP's motivation, as far as you know and can share, with cybersecurity threats and actions? Because we've been hearing colleagues and everyone talking about all these little examples and all the tools and this and that. But what's the goal here? Is it to chip away at our economy? Is it to make us look weak? And in fact, I think even just some of what we're positing today is perpetuating, I think, some of this position of weakness rather than strength, because much of this technology is technology we've created. But that's another point. I'm more interested in the why.
Well, my starting point would be that, as with most questions about the Chinese government's tactics and strategy, when one asks, is it A, B, or C, the answer is usually D, all the above. And in the context of cyber threats, they are using their biggest hacking program in the world to try to steal our intellectual property, to advance their own economic engine. They're trying to steal our personally identifiable information to feed into the influence operations and other tactics that we've talked about here already in this hearing. They're using their cyber targeting to suppress dissidents and critics. And, as is revealed through the operation we've talked about and announced here this morning, they're using their cyber targeting to pre-position on our critical infrastructure to be able, should they so choose, to conduct a destructive or disruptive attack on our critical infrastructure at the time of a conflict. So they're doing all those things. They all feed up ultimately into their goal to supplant the U.S. as the world's greatest superpower.
I'm in agreement in that the goal is to supplant the U.S. We are in a competition with China, and frankly, they're the only nation that has the means to reshape the international order, and means being diplomatic, economic, military. We are in a competition. We have to acknowledge that. We'll not lose sight of it. We also need to manage that competition responsibly to avoid the confrontation and conflict. And we can do that by continuing to operate with competence, not yielding the initiative, not merely staying on the defensive, but being as strong as the United States has always been. We look at the national security strategy. It says to invest at home to maintain our strength.
So we shouldn't consider cybersecurity attacks warfare? I mean, I know General Nakasone, you're here, and what are they doing over there? I mean, do they have a department that is just focused on cyber attacks? Because this is sort of, in some respects, hard to wrap our heads around, right? I mean, I know, Ray, you've got your whole caboodle that you can talk about and then can't talk about, but I'm just more or less interested in terms of, how are we choosing to respond to these things? What's our perch, and what do we know about how they're actually putting all this stuff together?
Well, we know a lot about what they're doing, as we've talked about today. We also know who's doing it. We know how they're structured. We know their version of the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command. We also know that they have very, very specific organizations that are targeting different parts of the world, to include the United States of America. And now I think the important thing is, now that we know that, what are we doing about it? And this is to the point of the department's strategy is that we defend forward. We operate outside the United States to be able to impose costs on our adversaries, either by enabling our partners or acting. And that's the important piece.
I am just out of time, but Ms. Easterly, as someone who founded the Women in STEM caucus here, bipartisan caucus in the Congress, it is such a treat to hear your expertise. You've been phenomenal. All of you have. Thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Critical infrastructure and intellectual property across California are at risk of being attacked by the CCP and other adversaries. This could have serious consequences for my constituents. In May, the LA Times wrote about threats of cyber attacks on our water infrastructures. And then I'm, seeing all these directors, and then you're head of cyber attacks or cybersecurity, head of all these departments. What we do, interagency coordination on cyber attacks and vulnerability at ports around the world with U.S. military and commercial present. Because I think anybody can answer, because you are talking about what your agency has been doing and how you are protecting, from the cyber attacks, but how are we working together with all these different agencies?
So I'll start saying a couple things. So with respect to ports specifically, so CISA was built by Congress in 2018 to serve the role as the national coordinator for critical infrastructure security and resilience. So we work with all of the sector risk management agencies to ensure that we can work with industry to help them understand the risk so that they can manage that risk and reduce that risk. And we have a phenomenal partnership with the U.S. Coast Guard, where we work with them day in and day out to do cyber assessments, to help with vulnerability scanning, to ensure that all of the maritime transportation sector has what they need to reduce risk. The other point I'd make, particularly if the CCP is watching this hearing, and I assume that they are, is the strength of our cyber capabilities in the United States of America is that we operate as a team. There may be different people doing different things, but all of us work incredibly closely together, and we know that our strength is our unity as we work together.
How about other allies? Because like Lodging, maritime tracking system, we are not using it, fortunately, here in this country, but you know what? Our allies like Japan, South Korea, Portugal, Spain, they're using it. And China, CCP knows exactly what's going in and out, and even that our naval ships are going into those countries. How we protect that, and how are we going to work with the other countries too?
So we almost invariably, on almost all the things we've been talking about here today, especially in cyber, are working with foreign partners, our closest foreign partners, who are themselves, as you say, also being targeted by the CCP. And especially in the context of cyber, our focus is on conducting joint sequenced operations, which almost invariably involve not just U.S. partners, but sometimes as many as 10 or 20 foreign partners all working together in tandem to try to have the whole be greater than the sum of the parts. We've talked a lot about numbers, the disadvantage that we're at relative to the CCP, but as General Nakasone said, one thing we have is partnerships, true partnerships, which allow us to have kind of our two, the U.S.'s two, together with some other country, say it's Japan's two, and have it equal 5, to get synergies when working together. And that's ultimately our best defense against the CCP.
So China is ready to attack by 2027 Taiwan. And we heard, and we had a great meeting with former Defense Secretary Gates, and he was the one actually talking about more of, it's not going to be the war, but more of the commercial stops, means that they're going to just stop all these ships going in and out. That's the way they're going to isolate Taiwan. But when the other countries are still using those systems, and especially in the United States, our cranes were made by China, and they're actually controlling it. You were talking about that just a little gas line that, we got into trouble. But when they stop, all those cranes that what we are using in the United States ports, we are in big trouble. And then we cannot communicate, or we can communicate maybe, don't know. But you know what, we cannot really bring anything to Taiwan since that's islands. So we really have a big problem. So what kind of thing that we are really preparing that, how we're going to really go inside the CCP and find out that exactly what they are doing. And I think Congresswoman Stevens was talking about that. Do they have their own department? I think they do, and just only do cyber attacks. So how much we know that inside of China, that what they are doing to us and to other countries?
We have a tremendous amount of insight in terms of how they're organized, what their plans are, and what they're doing. This is one of the things that the National Security Agency spends a tremendous amount of time on, and we have a very, very good insight in terms of what their intent is.
The gentleman, anyone else want to comment?
Thank you very much for all witnesses today, and learned a lot. I had to get out because Ways and Means Committee meetings, but thank you so much, Chairman.
Thank you. Home stretch. 2 more, I think. I just jinxed it. Someone may come back. Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, could you assure the American public today that no nonviolent protester about a ceasefire of the Middle East will be investigated or surveilled by the FBI?
We are not going to be investigating nonviolent First Amendment activity.
And could you just assure, whatever their position is on the Middle East or the 2024 election, if there is an American who's out there engaged in expressing their view, whether that is for a ceasefire or whatever that is, the FBI is not going to be investigating them or surveilling them, correct?
Our mission is to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution, and we intend to do both. We embrace both parts of that mission. In our view, it doesn't matter what you're ticked off about or who you're ticked off at. There's a right way under the First Amendment to exercise those views, and we're going to help protect that. And there's a wrong way to exercise those views, and that's violence and threats, and we are going to investigate that.
I appreciate your saying that, because I think I share your view that the First Amendment and peaceful protest is at the heart of our democracy. I also have appreciated some of your views on making sure that as we appropriately investigate Chinese threats to infrastructure and the Chinese Communist Party's threats and deal with the cybersecurity, you've been very clear that you do not think that that should involve the profiling of Chinese Americans, and I think you've been sensitive in some remarks you made at University of Michigan about how in the past that has happened. Can you speak to some of the past history of profiling of Asian Americans and how under your leadership you're going to make sure that that doesn't happen as we appropriately investigate Chinese Communist Party threats to the United States?
We are going to aggressively pursue the threat posed by the CCP with investigations that are predicated on the facts and the law and our policies. And they're not going to be based on race, ethnicity, or national origin, and they haven't been. Now, it is the case that the Chinese government aggressively targets individuals here to enlist them in their efforts, but they also aggressively suppress and coerce and harass Chinese Americans and Chinese visitors here. And so we view as part of our role to help protect those people. And so part of the key is drawing the distinction in between the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, the malicious actor, and Chinese Americans, Chinese dissidents, the victims.
And as you do this, Director Wray, like I said, I think under your leadership, from your public comments, you've been quite good about drawing that distinction. But do you bring to it a historical awareness that Asian Americans in this country have been profiled in our history, just like I'm sure you have a historical awareness of the FBI's role during the Civil Rights Movement?
Certainly, there have been abuses or mistakes in the past, and we're determined to make sure that those things don't happen again. But I do want to make clear that our work, at least since I've been director, focused on Chinese aggression, is based on the facts and the law and proper predication.
And you can assure sort of Chinese Americans that they aren't being profiled or targeted in any way based on their ethnicity or race?
We are not going to open investigations based on profiling people for race, ethnicity, or national origin or anything of that sort.
Thank you. I'm done with my questions.
Thank you. And finally, a special guest, the esteemed chairman of the Homeland Security Subcommittee on Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection, Representative Garbarino. I have to ask unanimous consent for the gentleman to participate and ask questions at this hearing. Unanimous consent. Ominous dominus. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, for allowing me to visit today as a special guest. And I look forward to continuing to work with you all on building resilience as our CCP cyber threat. First, Director Wray, I'd like to say I took an international trip with some other colleagues, and we met with some of your employees over, your men and women in some other countries, and they are doing a phenomenal job, especially on the cyber threat level. So I'm saying great job with that. Director Easterly, it's good to see you. I wanted to ask you a question. The intelligence community has been warning for years that China has the ability to launch cyber attacks to disrupt U.S. critical infrastructure. In response to the persistence of this threat, I understand CISA has hired a new associate director to lead China operations. Can you please provide an update on the work of what's been completed over the last 6 months, and what do you have for the remainder? What plans for the remainder of the year?
Great. Thanks so much. Great to see you, Chairman. Early last year, we decided to stand up a whole element under the Associate Director for China Operations, and so we hired a terrific subject matter expert, Andrew Scott, to lead that effort, really a cross-agency effort, to ensure we had a deep understanding of the threat to critical infrastructure and that we could work effectively with our partners across the interagency at the state and local level, and of course with industry, to be able to build the security and the resilience that we need to defend the nation from these threats. Since that period of time, we, of course, as we've been talking about in this hearing, we have affirmatively found and eradicated Chinese intrusions in our critical infrastructure, a whole variety of sectors that we believe are being used to preposition and prepare for destructive cyber attacks. So we have many lines of effort. One is about evicting cyber actors. One is about providing our free services to all of our stakeholders across the country so they have the vulnerability capabilities to identify and drive remediation of these vulnerabilities and exploits taken advantage of by the Chinese cyber actors. And then, as we've been talking about here, really catalyzing that operational collaboration, those public-private partnerships, because between government and the intelligence community, we really need industry to help build that mosaic so we have a deep understanding of the threat so that we can together reduce risk to the American people.
Is the JCDC, you talk about those collaborations, the JCDC, Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, what value is that adding to your China operations?
Yeah, this was, of course, the great innovation brought to us by the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Started out as the JICPO. We turned it into the JCDC because I like rock and roll. But we've had that stood up for over 2.5 years now. We went from 10 companies that we're working with to over 200. And it really has been the platform that we've used to catalyze that operational collaboration, which has rooted in three fundamental things: a recognition that a threat to one business could be a threat to many. Why letting FBI and CISA know about a cyber threat incident is so critical. Second, it's really the reciprocal responsibilities of government and industry to recognize that we have to share information in real time, that has to be transparent. The government has to add value. The government has to be responsible in terms of how we protect data. And then finally, what the JCDC offers is a scalable way for us to share information, not just with the private sector, but very important partners across the government, like the National Security Agency Cyber Collaboration Cell and FBI's NCI JTF. So it really does help to put operational collaboration across the cyber ecosystem on steroids. And again, we're very grateful to the Congress for helping to fund it and authorize it, and to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission for coming up with that great idea.
Thank you, Director. Director Coker, congratulations on the new position. I wanted to, in your opening testimony, you mentioned administration's focusing on harmonizing cyber regulation in furtherance of the National Cyber Strategy. As you understand, the SEC recently finalized a cyber incident rule that goes, what I believe is against CERCIA, and so does the Department of Homeland Security. And many sectors have said that with this new rule, their cyber employees are going to be spending half their time on compliance instead of facing the threats from CCP cyber threats. As we pursue a CRA this week, the Senate might pass it, and we're going to try to pass it in the House. What is the administration doing to harmonize between agencies and departments?
And thank you for your kind words and for raising this important topic to us. Part of the National Cybersecurity Strategy has been to do regulatory harmonization. And the point of that regulatory harmonization is to reduce the burden of compliance. And the way we're going about that, we have issued a request for information and received more than 80 responses from the private sector and public sector. Right now, we are going through the process of better understanding those, again, with the goal of reducing the burden of compliance. So that's our goal right there. We understand that.
I appreciate that. I'm out of time, but someone should tell the SEC that, though, okay?
I thank the gentleman, and pleasure to have you here. You're welcome back anytime. Well, maybe not anytime, but two comments, and then we'll close, and I'll recognize the ranking member. One of the first things I said in our first hearing was that the stakes of this competition were existential. Now, I got a lot of blowback for that, but I don't think after the testimony we've heard today, there could be any doubt. I mean, there is one path where we stumble into a war for which we're ill-prepared, and even victory might have existential consequences in the sense that it would transform America into a garrison state. Or there's another path in which we slowly succumb to the sedation of TikTok and we surrender, and we no longer stand for the ideals and values that America stands for, that the rest of the world is looking to us to stand for. And so while this hearing has revealed many things we need to do, and while the competition in cyber with China is one that's going to outlast my time in Congress, I'm confident of that, there are things that we must do now urgently. Foremost among them, in my opinion, particularly in light of the testimony we heard from Director Wray, either ban or force the sale of TikTok. I mean, it's bordering on national suicide if we continue down this road. And I get that TikTok has hired an army of lobbyists, including former members of Congress who are collecting a paycheck, but the time is now to do something about this. And by the way, if you're invested in ByteDance, you're not going to take TikTok public in America under the current ownership structure. So if only in your own financial interest, we have to find a way to force a separation. The time is now to act. Okay, on that happy note, I will transition to recognizing the hard work of the Democrat Staff Director, John Stivers, who is departing the committee this week after 25 years of service on the Hill, almost as long as General Nakasone has been in uniform. I will confess, John, we've worked together for a year. You have aged me personally 3 years in that time. There have been moments when I have lied awake in bed thinking, you know, life would be easier if you did leave, but now I'm sad now that it's happening. And one thing I've learned in working with John, and particularly working in the human rights community, he's been doing this since before it was cool, and he's truly a hero. in the human rights community. And it's been very cool to be able to see that. And I'll give you the highest compliment I could give you, John, which is that if I had to negotiate with Xi Jinping with the fate of the free world on the line, I would want you on my team because I know you would drive him crazy. So it's been a pleasure to work with you. And with that, I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you so much, Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses. This has truly been a really important hearing, a call to action more than anything else. And I think that Mike and I were talking during the hearing about several ideas that you folks generated that we need to follow up on, and we'll do so on a bipartisan basis. And thank you for your service. Thank you, General Nakasone, for everything that you've done for our nation and for coming today, as well as all of you. And I will remember CISA.gov from Ms. Easterly, so thank you so much. As we try to enlist our civilian partners in our collective defense, collective cyber defense, and employ what you call cyber hygiene, which I love. And then I would also like to recognize our staff director, John, who's departing today. Mike covered the highlights, but he's also had other very distinguished roles in government. He was an assistant administrator for Asia at USAID. He was a commissioner to the U.S.-China Economic Security Review. He was a senior advisor to Leader Pelosi. And, now he's off to the next chapter, the next 25 years. And so I look forward to continuing to collaborate between us and you in your next roles. And I just want to give him a big round of applause for his service. I'm not done. I am done. I yield back. Thank you.
Without objection, questions for the record are due 1 week from today. Without objection, the committee hearing is adjourned.
Christy, I need to help you. is, like, you did feel, I feel like I got away. Yeah, so thank